I'd like to welcome you to the fifth in our lecture series for 2025, and the title of today's lecture is Australia's Civil Maritime Capability in Challenging Geostrategic Times, and it'll be presented by Ms Angela Gillum, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Maritime Industry Australia Limited. Never before has the vulnerability of our civilian maritime resources been highlighted than during the COVID pandemic and the recent inimical naval manoeuvrings off our east coast and indeed our continent. Angela has represented the maritime industry on a number of critical government and industry committees. In 2022, she was appointed to the Government Strategic Fleet Task Force. It handed down its report in November 2023 with recommendations to arrest the decline in Australian flagged shipping and improve the resilience in times of need and supply chain security in times of disruption. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Angela Gillum to the podium.
Thanks very much, Ron, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honour to be here in this amazing building, speaking to you about some really important issues, and I have a feeling I'll be preaching to the choir somewhat with a few things that I'm going to cover. I'll start by just explaining Maritime Industry Australia and who we are. We're the National Association for the shipping industry in Australia. These are our members, our full members. We have about the same again in associate members. Our vision is for a prosperous Australia with a strong sovereign maritime capability. We are about promoting the positive business environment for operators of ships within, around, into and out of Australia, and we're concerned with the business of employing seafarers as well. So we're about the ship and the people that work on the ship. There are organisations like ours in many other maritime nations, and most of us belong to an international organisation called the International Chamber of Shipping. So we're part of an international community of ship owners. We're part of the domestic community. A lot of our members are cargo owners, so they're concerned with being able to access assets and the efficiency of the operation of those assets. Some of our members who are cargo owners also own ships, and others just charter ships for their logistics purposes. So it's quite a diverse membership. Some of those operators operate the large international ships, so ships that are certified to trade internationally, and others are involved in the domestic commercial vessel space, which are smaller vessels that never leave Australia, and some have a bit of both. So it is quite a diverse membership base, and we provide advice under several different pieces of regulation. So our role really is, I guess we're a lobby group in some ways. I prefer to say we're an advocacy group representing the interests of our members to government. We provide regulatory and advisory services in operations, environmental compliance, and importantly workplace relations. So we cover a whole suite of regulatory frameworks that govern the business of operating ships in Australia. My presentation isn't very long, it's very high level. I'm going to touch on some things that are of major concern to our organisation and our members. I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection between Australia's security position and our sovereign maritime capability. And I think when I finish my presentation, I'm really hoping for lots of questions. And if I can't answer those questions, I'm really happy to follow up with you at a later date. But I'm giving the business of shipping perspective on sovereign maritime capability in Australia. Just for a bit of context, some facts and figures about seaborne trade. Australia has, I think, we're still about the 5th largest shipping task of any nation in the world. So that's quite significant. It's right to think that a lot of it's dirt that we ship offshore to China and other places in the world. That's true by weight and volume. That's absolutely correct. But I think the thing that's missing from people's minds often is how reliant we are on imports for the running of our economy. And I think one of the most critical imports is liquid fuels. So we import about over 80% of our liquid fuel consumption into Australia. We only have 2 operating refineries left. The small amount of crude that we produce in our offshore wells isn't actually refined in our refineries, it's exported, and we import crude to process in our refineries. So if we did ever need to use our own crude, there would be some tinkering that would have to happen to our refineries to allow that to happen. And I think that's an important thing to realise. The other thing about that is we'd have to move our liquid fuels or our crude product from one side of the country to the other where the refineries exist. And the only real way you can do that is via ship. So not only is international shipping critical to Australia's economy, domestic shipping is also absolutely fundamental to our manufacturing and our ability to move goods around this gigantic island at the bottom of the world and at the end of the global supply chain. So, you know, if I could emphasise the point how critical the shipping industry is to global trade, but I think Australia is quite unique in how critical shipping is to our well-being as a nation. There's some other statistics there. I'm not going to go through them with you, but I'm sure this information could be made available to you afterwards. Just touching on domestic trade. So, there's the 3 modes, or 4 modes: aviation, rail, road, and there's shipping, and a significant amount of shipping occurs around Australia's coast that's fundamental to our economy. So iron ore from the west to the east, container trade from the east to the west. Not much comes back west-east, which is actually quite problematic when you have an issue with infrastructure, land-based infrastructure being washed out. It's very difficult to get tonnage to go west-east. So there's some real complicating factors to the way domestic trade flows work in Australia and what's economical. So a little bit about the state of the Australian trading fleet. About 30 years ago, we had over 100 Australian flag vessels operating internationally. We had a large contingent in international trade, and we also did a lot of our own domestic freight movements. So that's Australian flag, Australian crude vessels. Now we have about 9, some people say 11, depends on how you want to categorise this class of ship. So they're made up of the 6 ro-ro ships that operate across Bass Strait. They're fully utilised, absolutely dedicated to those berths and to the Tasmanian mainland trade, because a lot of the Tasmanian international freight goes through Melbourne and is exported at that point. Well, all of it is. There is little to no. Someone's going to pull out a fact that I wasn't aware of, but I don't think there is any direct international market for Tasmania, so it all has to go through Melbourne, which is why that Bass Strait trade is subject to the Freight Equalisation Scheme, part of the National Highway. There's a couple of cement carriers, so these are bulk carriers, but these cement carriers are absolutely dedicated to their specific trade, so they have pneumatic cargo handling equipment. They can't just tramp around and go to different, be utilised in different bulk trade categories. They're very specific to their purpose, they're purpose built. And there's some transshippers, so big. They have an engine, they have accommodation, but they're pretty big dumb bulk carriers, and they're also in various locations around Australia. So that's what we've got in the event that we ever needed shipping capability to to come to the aid of Australians and people within our region in times of need. There's also some government vessels. There's the Navy Supply and Sustainment Fleet, and one of our members, TK, actually exclusively provides services to Navy. So there's towage, there's the oilers, there's also Border Force. Border Force have a civilian crewed, at least one, maybe two vessels. There's the Niuna, the Australian Antarctic Division Antarctic vessel that does our Antarctic sustainment trips during summer. And the CSIRO Investigator, another scientific marine research vessel that's owned by the government. And there's the AMSA emergency towage vessel. So this is emergency towage capability that can be deployed for vessels in distress to avoid a catastrophic environmental and safety issue. And there's one of those to service the whole coast. So I don't know if I'm making my point here, but we are very low in terms of sovereign commercial maritime capability in Australia. Nearly all of the domestic freight task is completed by vessels that are flagged in other countries, owned by companies that have no connection or obligation to Australia. So they're here to provide a really critical logistics service to our economy, and they do a fantastic job. But there is no levers for the government to call upon utilisation of those vessels if they're needed, other than opening their wallet. We also have a huge and diverse and really important domestic commercial vessel fleet, so it would be remiss of me not to mention that fleet. We're talking about towage vessels, we're talking about ferries, dredges, a whole heap of vessels operating in the offshore oil and gas industry, really diverse landing barges that service the remote communities in Northern Australia. They provide really critical access to goods and services. But the use of these vessels is limited. They're small, they're not certified to trade internationally, they're very dedicated to the trade that they're involved in, but they are there and they're diverse, and they play a really significant and important part in the Australian economy. Australia also has two registers. So we have the Australian General Shipping Register, and this is the register where you have to have a full Australian crew complement. So you're an Australian flagship. You're eligible for a general licence, and so that means you're able to access exclusive rights to domestic cargo, and you're entitled to operate and carry domestic cargo around Australia. Also certified to trade internationally, but the general registers vessels generally don't. We also have the Australian International Shipping Register, and this is something that I don't think is on many people's radar. This is an attempt that was introduced in 2012 as an attempt to try and create a framework whereby Australian companies can compete on the international market. So the Australian International Shipping Register allows for mixed crew. So the top two, the master and the chief engineer, must be Australian. You must have a trainee complement on board, but the rest of the crew could be from mixed nations, and that has a significant bearing on the operating cost. Basically, it's a surefire way to reduce the operating cost. Unfortunately, there is no ships registered on the AISR at the moment, so it's not worked, and we need to find out. I mean, we have some theories about why, but it's just not worked, and so our members absolutely see the AISR as an opportunity. We just need that constant policy attention, which I'll talk about soon. So this is the situation in the background of some pretty intense years of supply chain disruptions. We had the pandemic, which created significant supply chain disruptions and an imbalance of containers around the world, log jams in ports. I mean, it basically drove the cost of living crisis that we're dealing with now on an ongoing basis. We had the washout of the rail line, the east-west rail line, during, I think that was 2020, 2023 or 2022, which basically cut East and West Australia off. We had the destruction of the Fitzroy River Bridge in the Kimberley, completely isolated a Kimberley community. They were getting supplies helicoptered in. They had multiple landing barges providing goods and services and essentials into that community, but they needed access to a large ship to be able to come alongside either in Wyndham or Broome, and the government really struggled to access the capability to provide those services to that isolated community. Also had some horrific natural disasters in our region. Tsunamis, earthquakes, these are the types of things that Australia should be leaning into to providing assistance to our Pacific neighbours, more so now than ever before. We also had the war in Ukraine. That had significant impact on gas prices, and also drove a lot of the cost of living pressures that we're still feeling today. So why does it matter? You know, there are people that I know that don't think it matters, that, you know, Australian shipping is too expensive, the industrial relations issues cause too many problems, it's not worth it, it doesn't matter, you can call up ships from the international market to use anytime you want. We disagree with that, and there's a few reasons why at the moment, and I think if some of my Department of Infrastructure and Transport colleagues were here, they would agree that there are no levers. The government has no levers at the moment to direct vessels to do anything other than opening a giant chequebook, and even then there's conditions around that. So we need the capability to not only provide assistance to Australian communities in times of need after natural disasters, but also, as I mentioned, in the Asia Pacific region, we need to be, as you know, as a large, wealthy country in the Indo-Pacific, we need to be leaning in to have a really strong presence in our region. Supply chain disruptions are happening more frequently with climate change driven natural disasters on the increase, extreme weather events. We're going to see more breakdown of land-based infrastructure, and we need to have resilience to be able to provide other ways or create other ways to access those communities and keep goods flowing around the country. National security, it's probably, I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'm sure everyone in this room understands the really critical interplay between merchant marine and defence marine, and how the important role that the merchant navy plays in sustainment, mobilisation and supply to defence. And I think it's safe to say that the Australian defence sector is thinking very, very carefully about what they can do to support the resurgence of Australian sovereign maritime capability in the civil space, because it's absolutely recognised that critical interplay between the two. And I think one of the most important reasons why we need to address this issue is we have a maritime skills crisis at the moment. We have, 9 to 11, as I said, depending on how you want to classify these vessels that are capable of training tomorrow's mariners. That's not a lot, and this is to supply not just the seagoing industry. These skills are utilised across the economy for the safe operation of ports, for the regulatory authority. AMSA, Australian Maritime Safety Authority, needs STCW qualified skills within their organisation to ensure they're able to uphold the law. We need a depth of understanding within the industry. We need the shore-based roles within the resource companies to understand the technical nature of ship operation, and without a pipeline of people going through their seagoing careers and obtaining the skills and experience that you can only do through a life at sea, we'll be importing those skills basically. And most harbour masters employed around Australia have been employed through the immigration pathway, which is fine and that's great. But there is a global skills crisis being faced by the industry. We're having major attraction problems at the international level, and to continue to rely on immigration to plug these holes is a very short-sighted way of dealing with a major strategic issue in Australia. So this is another reason why we need to address this issue as a nation. It's not easy, it's going to be really hard, because those issues are real. Cost, industrial relations, inability to compete on the global market, they are real issues, but we need to address them. So the path back, we need to create the business environment where the international industry recognises an opportunity and sees the benefit of flagging assets in Australia on an open market where you can get the best. You can operate in a zero tax environment. So your seafarers pay no corporate income, pay no personal income tax, where you as a business pay no corporate tax, and you can operate that vessel anywhere you like in the world, including Australia. So that's the kind of competitive environment that Australian businesses are up against. We have, in 2012, the previous Labor government, actually under Anthony Albanese, he was Transport Minister at the time, so that's great, introduced a shipping reform package which included a zero corporate tax regime. But there's certain aspects of that make it not as beneficial as comparative regimes. We have a seafarers income tax rebate scheme, but it's not benefiting anyone at the moment because we don't have a large contingent of Australian seafarers working on international trading ships. So we've got little bits of the right thing. We've got the general framework, but we need it tweaked and improved to make sure that we can be competitive. Competitive tax arrangements. We currently have a cabotage regime in Australia. We need to maintain that. We need to make sure that Bass Strait, those 6 vessels operating on Bass Strait, continue to be Australian crewed, because at the moment they are the core of our training pipeline. So we cannot wind that back. We cannot deregulate our domestic cargo. We need to reform our training and skills development system. It is incredibly costly, I think, upwards of $300,000 to create a master mariner to the lowest level. So, and that's the point where they get poached to go and work as a marine pilot, or go and work in a port as a harbour master. So we need to share the cost. You cannot expect those 9 vessels to do all the training and bear all the cost for the benefit of the whole economy. So we need real reform in that space. I'm going to say it, we need to address the industrial relations issues that we have in the seagoing workforce. We can't shy away from that. It's not, people conflate the stevedoring issues with the seagoing workforce. We haven't really had any industrial action on board Australian vessels for decades. But there are significant issues in EA negotiations that need to be addressed that are keeping operators away. People don't want to deal with the Australian unions, it's a fact. We now have the strategic fleet policy, so I'll go to my next slide and talk a little bit about that, but basically at a high level, it's up to 12 Australian flag, Australian crewed, commercially operated, privately owned vessels that will be subject to a subsidy in a very basic form, paid by the government. So I did participate in the Strategic Fleet Task Force. We produced a report that went to government mid-2023, and the government responded to the 16 recommendations that were in that report, and I'll talk about the government's response in my next slide. But there were some pretty strong overarching themes. I've touched on the cost of Australian shipping. You know, if we don't address the cost, the strategic fleet policy will be very short-lived. It's not sustainable to be in receipt of such a high subsidy to continue operating. The report identified that there is absolutely a benefit to national resilience from sovereign maritime capability in a whole range of areas: skills, defence, supply chain resilience, and the ability to provide a humanitarian response when needed. 12 ships aren't going to cut it. I mean, 12 ships is a great start, it's a great skills base, but it's not going to provide the sort of resilience that we need as big island nation at the end of the global supply chain. So something else needs to happen. And that is, we need to create the business environment that stimulates natural growth, that makes people want to base their operations from here, makes people want to flag their assets in the Australian flag. The other important point is that the task force noted that the cost premium can't be borne by shippers. So we can't just say, well, you know, we'll tighten up cabotage, we'll tighten up the coast, you can't move any domestic goods without using an Australian ship, because the cost of doing that will flow onto the consumer immediately. And, you know, that ship has sailed, pardon the pun. We cannot impose those additional costs on the Australian public. We need to find another way. And that part of doing that, the part of the way to do that is by creating or improving the existing tax incentives to more level the playing field with the international operators. There was 16 recommendations. I won't go through each recommendation. They covered tax reform. If you want to, the report is publicly available. Just Google or Bing or whatever browser you use. Strategic Fleet Task Force report. But the recommendations covered off on pretty much everything to do with tax, to do with training, to do with the need to ensure regulation for access for domestic trade. Some of the recommendations are quite controversial. There's a couple of levies proposed. One we are supportive of, and that is to fund maritime skills. The other one is a little trickier, because that's a levy on every ship visiting Australia, which would actually provide a funding stream for this to subsidise the 12 vessels. Very controversial, that one. And the government responded in a range of ways: agree in principle, and noted being nah, I don't think so, and sort of scaling up to yes, let's move on this. So progress. So in the 2024-25 budget, there was an allocation of $21.7 million to the department. I think some people have interpreted that as the whole allocation. It's not. That is just to scale up capability within the department to administer the strategic fleet program, and that has happened. I mean, there are so many more people dealing with shipping issues now than there ever has been in my whole 20 years of doing this, being involved in this industry. So that's good. The department is still learning about the business of shipping, but you can't expect them to know everything straight away. Within that budget allocation was an undisclosed amount, and that undisclosed amount will go to subsidise the strategic fleet vessels. And at the moment, the government is negotiating with I don't know how many operators on finalising that tender. The government also committed to reviewing the Shipping Registration Act and the Coastal Trading Act, so that goes to, again, the cabotage arrangements, but also improving the registration process within Australia. So how can we get the second register, the international register, how can we tweak that to attract more people to participate? Stuff about the Schedule A wages, I won't go into that, that's a whole other can of worms. And importantly, in March this year, the government, just prior to the election, announced $16.9 million, which would be specifically allocated to unlocking sea time for cadets. So this is a really important move, because what we have a situation in Australia where, you know, I might be a bright young thing, I want to go to sea, I put myself through pre-sea at the AMC or one of the other TAFE providing that course. But to move on in my certification, I need sea time. With 9 ships, it's very difficult to access that sea time. So this funding is about incentivising operators to unlock and create additional berths and the opportunity for new entrants to access that practical experience that they need to progress through to certification. Without it, they can't get to watchkeepers. So at the moment we're in negotiations with the government on how that funding gets out there and how it's rolled out. So that's a really positive thing. But again, it is a drop in the ocean. to what needs to happen. Another pun, sorry. So that's all pretty doom and gloom. I didn't talk much about the requirement for maritime capability beyond defence. We have a huge offshore decommissioning task that we're facing at the moment. We had a function with CODA, the Centre for Offshore Decommissioning Australia, recently, and the numbers of ships and people that they are going to need to take apart, I mean, the first one is Bass Strait, to take apart the offshore facilities and recycle them. It is eye-watering. It's just not going to be possible to do without a concerted effort in training mariners up to the level that they require. Also, there has never been a time in the geopolitical sense that justifies what we've been asking for so long, like there is now. It is time that Australia stands up in the Indo-Pacific region, has more of a presence here, creates more resilience and capability within our own, not only defence navy, but merchant navy. And so I guess, the stars are aligning in terms of MIAL's message and the industry's message to government about the need to really focus on this really important strategic issue, and of course climate change driven natural disasters. So the priority areas for MIAL, really to promote that Australia is a maritime nation. We've sort of forgotten that. People forget that we are a big island and we are so reliant on international shipping, and any kind of disruption, big or small, in international trade has a major impact on our well-being and our economy. So that is absolutely a priority for us. We really want to promote that concept. We need to improve the fiscal environment, and that goes to recommendation 1. We need to at least match the incentives provided to foreign lines operating in Australia. And we need to really focus on reform and addressing some of the systemic issues that exist in our maritime training regime. So that's our priorities. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. Lots of information, so really happy to take questions if there are any. I've got no idea how long I've been going for.
Thank you. Questions, and as is our usual practice, would you please give your name and affiliation before asking your question?
Malcolm Brown, I'm a retired journalist, former serviceman, Australian Army. The bottom line of what you're saying is that Australia should become more self-sufficient. Australia should be a sovereign nation, not dependent on anybody. Well, it's got echoes of Donald Trump saying that America should be isolationist and not depend on anyone else. But my question is, we have ships doing these, foreign flag ships doing this trade in Australia and doing it adequately. Is there ever going to be an occasion when we're going to be denied international involvement in our coastal trade, and we are going to be forced to rely on ourselves?
To answer your first, I think there was one question in there, and that is no. I think it's unlikely that there would be a blockade in the South China Sea, for example, that stopped foreign ships coming here. I think that's unlikely. It's not completely out of the question. I am not at all proposing a Trump-style isolationist policy. What I'm proposing here is that we need some measure of resilience, and I think our allies, like the United States, like the UK, expect us to have some kind of capability. We cannot continue to rely and just say everything's going to be okay. We can just rely on foreign interests to look after little old Australia down here. We can't do that anymore. Whether it's in a national security perspective or just the basic lack of maritime skills, we need to be able to produce these people who have the skills and experience of having had a life at sea to be able to operate our ports safely at the very basic level. We need that, and at the moment,
we have the bottom of the triangle trying to train and recruit people for the whole economy, and that is unsustainable. So I apologise if I made that impression that we should take an isolationist policy. Absolutely not. We are always going to rely heavily on foreign ships. A lot of our members have exclusively foreign ships. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about having a level of resilience and a level of sovereign capability to meet our needs in a crisis and to meet our day-to-day needs. Maritime skills is a perfect example of that.
Thank you. Ken Broadhead, RUSI. When you talk about addressing industrial relations, it reminds me of one of the most frightening books I've ever read called The Secret War by Paul Colbachs, about the behaviour of unions even during World War II. So it seems to me that one of the biggest problems you've got is really addressing the likely activities of unions, maritime unions and unions with significant activities on vessels such as electrical trades.
Yeah, there was I think Chief of Navy has actually been commenting in the press. He gave a speech somewhere. So there's an article about it in one of the papers today, and he calls out union behaviour as a real blocker for naval capability in shipbuilding and defence industry. But you know, there are also issues with civilian crewing of naval vessels. So it's an issue, but there's not a lot that we can do about it. We have great relationships with the unions at a high level. We work on a lot of strategically important issues together because we have to. But that, you know, there's not much that we can do other than encourage government on regulatory change. But you know, I think we've got a snowball's chance in hell.
Excuse me. My name is David James. I'm a marine engineer for 52 years. Made my living on the water as recently as 2013 in all manner of shipping, bridges, hydrofoils, tugboats, container ships, passenger ships and so forth. I'd like to say that, and I'm offering my opinion here as a member of the Institute of Marine and Power Engineers, that we see a lot of, in what you've presented there, of the work of MIAL, we find a great deal of agreement and support for the goals that you've set in place. One of the great problems in my industry, which I was in it originally in 1960, is that with the removal of Australian flag shipping and the reduction of training opportunities to bring young people into the industry, we are in a very desperate situation, in my personal opinion. Could I just touch on the training issue? In the latter half of last century, when I was a young chap, there was an institution called the National Maritime Industry Training Committee, and its job was a very good job of recruiting young people to come into the industry and supporting them through the initial stages of their training. From there they progressed in the case of the engineers with qualifying sea servers to be able to go on and sit for Class 2 and ultimately Class 1 foreign going AMSA qualified certificate. It's a great tragedy that training opportunity disappeared, and as a result of that, the age profile of officers, deck, engineer, and to a lesser extent seamen is in a pretty poor shape, because we really desperately need to get rejuvenation of the industry, which MIALS and we are trying to support. But part of that is getting training berths. We've got 9 ships on the register, and it's a bit hard to see how one particular company would be conducive to or attracted to taking in young trainees from a different company, unless there is some sort of financial offset, I would suggest, from the government to support training. So I don't know how that sits as a question, Angela, but...
I can comment on NMITC. So when I joined the association, NMITC had just fallen apart. I remember it being spoken about. So I think the story is there. It was not a mandatory contribution, and I think that's what needs to be different this time. We have been lacking the utility of a centralised coordination mechanism for maritime training that happens in every other maritime nation around the world. So the UK have it, Norway has a fantastic system, Germany has a system where everyone collectively puts into a pot and so training is equalised across the industry. We don't have that. And I think it fell apart because it wasn't contributions weren't mandatory. BHP were doing all the training and everyone else was basically paying for BHP cadets. And I think people got a bit cranky about that and withdrew. It's funny you should raise that because I was going through our archives recently and I found letters to my predecessor complaining about NMITC. So there's a lot of amazing history there, but we need to sort of remember the good bits, and that centralised mechanism, I think, is probably the only way to go if we want a sustainable system. But we probably need a bit of government intervention to create a mandatory levy or some mandatory contribution so that people can't just walk away, because then they could. Yeah, but no, people still talk about NMITC.
Good afternoon, Angela. Simon McAvoy, relationship to here. I'm the merchant seaman, just nudging on 40 years in the industry, and was trained through NMITC. I'm also a Naval Reserve Officer, I've been a Harbour Master, and I'm currently at sea. I've got several questions for you. I can comment on all this. Having lived through the demise of those 5 or 6 points you have as to why we failed. One of them is, what is the response about having the international register? What are you hearing from companies about not wanting to take it on? Another question, why was your report silent on the topic of coastal shipping competing with the subsidies of road transport? That's why we don't have the Black Widow ships anymore. The Townsville Trader, the Bass Trader, the Sydney Trader, where a lot of the training was done. And third one is, why can't we get back to NMITC? In asking those three, there's a few there, I'll just reflect on one of those though. There's a reason nations don't nationally flag anymore, and they go for flag convenience, and it goes back to the US Civil War. The Union States specifically flagged their ships out, say to the UK or the like, so their ships weren't attacked. Where does that fit in your picture of having Australian flag ships? So there's probably 4 questions.
I don't know if I can answer the last one. Why would you bother flagging a ship Australian?
Australian flag trade ships, I'm all for it, but why
Well,
would you bother?
you wouldn't, and you wouldn't. If our members came to us and said, or a company seeking advice about, we've got a ship, we want to put it on this trade, this domestic trade or international trade, how do you suggest we structure our business? I would say, well, don't flag it Australian, like step one. That's madness. But we want to change that. So that's what we need to do. We need to, and it goes to your question about the AISR, why aren't people flagging it? Or aren't people utilising it? There's probably a whole heap of reasons. It's not well promoted. So it was introduced in 2012 and the Labor government lost in 2013. And so there was no follow-up, and the coalition at the time kicked off by trying to unpick every positive shipping policy that was introduced in the previous government. So we were playing, our role then was to engage with the Senate to try and stop them unwinding the seafarers' tax offset. So everything that was positive was trying to be unwound, and then the coalition just stopped doing anything. And there was no, to create good policy, you need to constantly tend it like a garden. Like you need to say, has it working? Engage with the industry. what's working here. Listen with open ears to, you know, if it's in the national interest to have a shipping industry, business, tell us how to do it, right? So there was a decade of none of that at all, and prior to that, like decades of no attention at all. So I think with the AISR, I don't know, it's the corporate tax settings, it's kind of a why would you when you don't have to. It's targeted at international trade, so unless you want to curry favour with the Australian government, like why would you? So we need to flip that and create the environment. Well, why wouldn't you? To create so many reasons why you would want to flag under the AISR, whether that's, you know, whether that is a subsidy, a small subsidy, on an ongoing basis, or fixing the corporate tax measures so when you pay dividends to shareholders, they're not taxed at that point, because that's what's wrong with the setting at the moment. So it's not good. It's not as good as comparable tax environments. You know, deal with. I think a lot of international companies are terrified of the Australian unions, and the fact that you would need to have 2 Australians on board might be enough for them to walk away. There's lots of actual issues and perceived issues that are all sort of wound up, and then the fact that it's not really been promoted. So. Yeah, there's lots of work to do there. So is that all the questions?
Oh, I think it was about 3.
Yeah, NMITC, we are, at the moment, we're in a group, it's ourselves, the 3 unions and the resources sector. We meet regularly. We're looking at what kind of a group training arrangement, how that might work, how we would fund it. So I don't think we'll pick up NMITC and just use that again, but we'll take the lessons from the past and try and get a better outcome, but absolutely using that centralised model.
Probably the most important one was you've got the ships doing the freight equalisation across Bass Strait.
Oh, the road thing. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Road transport. That's what's killed off having sufficient number of coastal trading ships of a particular type. You're not going to replace bulk carriers with trucks and trains necessarily, trains yes, but so why is road transport getting so many advantages that shipping doesn't get?
That's a good question, but it's pretty controversial when you raise that. I mean, there's so many subsidies, there's layers of subsidies, state, federal, when you look at other modes, and you get into that modal tussle whereby there should be things that naturally fall, you know, they're better suited to shipping because they're huge volumes, it's port to port. The landside infrastructure is probably, you know, difficult in some trades, so it's complicated. But we didn't really talk about other modes in the task force. We really talked about the problem with shipping. But it's relevant. I'm not saying it's not relevant.
Bruce Skinner, member of Brucey and former Navy person, and as I mentioned earlier to you in private, I just submitted an article for our journal on the Maritime Strategy for Australia, which is an extension of the National Defence Strategy which was issued last year and which is currently being updated in a biennial fashion to address the whole maritime domain in which an island country exists. I hold up as an example of what are the necessity for access to merchant shipping and trade shipping and marine transport, the battle of the Falkland Islands, and how even the UK, who's always been a maritime nation and acted as such, needed commercial shipping to do what they did. When a couple of months ago Sir Peter Cosgrove addressed us about Interfed and the intervention in East Timor, if you look at the fine print of that, the logistic issues were tremendous and were not well organised. Anyway, to get to my question, one small one, why do we need an Australian master and chief engineer? Why can't we take anybody in that sort of ship? But more importantly, how would your institution or your organisation regard handing over a number of the more routine and mundane tasks now performed by Navy and Border Force to commercial operators, offshore surveillance, immigration, anti-drugs, etc. Could that be done better and more effectively by a commercial shipping organisation, and in which case that might open up a lot of training abilities. What do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, so that is a live discussion with ABF about. So there already is civilian capability there. There's, yeah, I don't want to talk about my personal opinion, but I know ABF are considering how they leverage the civilian workforce. Whatever, you know, that the thing is, every seagoing workforce in Australia is in absolute dire straits in terms of accessing skills. So we're talking with Navy, we're talking with ABF on how we could leverage each other's capability and do things like that. I think it'd be more. There may be tasks that could just go straight to the civilian sector, but again, we're at such a point now where we would need to build up to that. It's not we can't crew the 3 vessels that are part of the strategic fleet pilot. Like that, we will be using immigration to crew those vessels, or if not those, we'll be backfilling vessels that they came from, because it's an optical issue for the government if we've got 3 strategic fleet vessels that are crewed by foreign nationals. I mean, that's probably not going to look that good. So that's absolutely an option, and it is a live discussion at the moment with all of those organisations. The thing on the chief and the master and the chief engineer, that's an excellent question, and that is one of the changes that we would like to see made, that it's not specifically the master or chief engineer, because they are so hard to come by. But you need one of each in those strategic skills. So you can't have it wouldn't make sense to have 2 IRs, because they're not the strategic skills that need to be utilised in other parts of the economy. It's the engineers and the deck officers that are the strategically important skills, and so we need to focus on developing those people.
Angela, Paul says, I'm a fan of 12 ships. Why did you identify that number? And are these big ships? Are they 100,000 tonnes? Are they a mix of tankers? What's the plan, and when might they be in service?
So the pilot, I kind of skipped over that, but the government announced a pilot, which I stress wasn't a recommendation of the task force. We wanted them just to go for the 12, because a pilot kind of, we'll just give it a try. But anyway, that's what they're doing. So 12, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. It seems like a nice dozen. the 3 ships will be in operation there will be a ship on the water this year, I think, probably. They're still negotiating with the company. They're not telling anyone anything about where it's at, because they want to preserve. The government wants to preserve their negotiating position, and if it fails, they want to move to the next candidate. So, yeah, watch this space, I guess.
My name's Kevin Binder, I'm a Brucey member. In the 1990s, I worked for BHP, handed a sales pitch to the Royal Australian Navy. We boasted that we had a bigger fleet than the Royal Australian Navy, which was true at the time. What happened to BHP's fleet?
Well, BHP made a decision to get out of ship ownership at around about the time that I entered the industry, actually. So it was devastating for our organisation, because they were, the major ship owner in Australia. So it was devastating for the industry in general, but they made a decision to get out of that business entirely. I can't remember exactly why. Yeah, cost, I would say cost, and just exposure. It's not, it's not an easy business to be in, and I'm just guessing here, but focusing on their core business, I would say, and they didn't really see supply chain as their core business. Just lots of companies outsource their supply chain. Rio Tinto have taken a different approach, and so they're still a major ship owner in Australia, and internationally as well. So they like to control their supply chain.
Chris Bolton, member of RISI, former naval person, colleague of Chris Skinner, lifetime member of the Maritime Union of Australia, and a former naval person. My question is, Angela, you've outlined a can of worms, but more importantly, a real security issue. Who do you deal with in federal government?
Well, primarily we deal with Catherine King at the moment. She's the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, but we also engage as much as we possibly can with Defence. And so with Miles, Richard Miles, who's Defence Minister, and Defence Industry. But the problem is you get handballed back to infrastructure. So there's a school of thought that actually the strategic fleet policy should sit within Defence. And I would potentially support that, but I think because I guess it's not like there's a huge capability within the Department of Infrastructure on commercial shipping. There's not. They're rebuilding. All they know how to do is hand out temporary licences for coastal trading scheme. Like, that's all they've known. They're rebuilding. They're building up their capability, and they're getting there. But if the whole policy was moved to Defence, I don't think we would have like an issue with transitioning that knowledge. And if you wanted to sort of couch the policy as primarily being a national security issue, then it probably belongs there. That's a school of thought. But absolutely, it's infrastructure and transport and defence, as well as workplace relations, DUA, because of the workforce aspect, and the training. So a lot of the training stuff sits within DUA. Which is Amanda Rishworth now. You've hit on a real challenge for us, because it is a multi-jurisdictional, multi-policy area that covers a number of ministers, and you need all of those ministers' offices talking to each other and working together on outcomes, and that's a real challenge because politicians sort of are self-interested, and it's about trying to link those offices up to get real outcomes. Everything to do with shipping is multi-portfolio. It's a real challenge, I have to say.
Last question.
David Lees, I'm chair of the Institute Special Interest Group on Strategy. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for your personal contribution and the contribution of your organisation to maintaining and trying to develop an Australian merchant fleet again. I think it's very important to follow on from what Chris Skinner said a little earlier. One of the problems we had in the Timor issue in 1999 was while all the planners had told us that we'd be able to take up ships from anywhere in the world where we needed them, in the event we couldn't. And if you want to take up ships from trade, then the law says that, international law says, that you can only take them up from Australian flagged ships from your own register. Can't take them up from British registers or Yankee registers or whatever. So that was a big problem for us, and we learned a lesson, I hope. But that lesson, I think, may have been forgotten by a lot of people in defence today. I would like to ask 3 questions about your report, if I may. The first one is the 12 ships that were referred to. That, of course, was government policy. Your task force had to accept that as a given. But the report indicated that there were 4, I think it was, types of ships that the government should try to get. I was wondering, did you consider how many of each, or what proportion of each of those 4 types?
So I had a slide in here and I took it out but I should have kept it in on reflection, which talks about the ship types. So tankers, really important. So I think it was 2 of each tanker, but it's kind of nominal, and because these ships need to find a trade. So it's all well and good to say to meet our strategic requirements, we need 2 tankers and a couple of bulk carriers and some general cargo geared container ships. But if they can't find a trade within which to operate, it's really hard to, because that's the whole fundamentals. They need to find a commercial trade. So it was a mix of tankers, bulk carriers, geared general cargo. So for vessels that are able to operate in or with cranes.
Yeah.
So they're able to operate in places where there's no landside infrastructure. But tankers are really important for reasons that I mentioned earlier. And it's not just liquid fuel, it's chemicals as well.
Yes, and following on from that, if I may, you discussed personnel. I wonder, and you mentioned in terms of the overseas trade, the 2 positions, the master and the chief engineer. Was there any consideration given to those people or crews where the 12 ships were supposed to be fully Australian crews, as I understand it, under government policy? What about the role of those crew being Royal Australian Naval Reserve? Was there any thought given to that?
Yes, yeah, but so we did have those discussions in the task force, but also there is a live discussion within the Australian Maritime Defence Council. So MIAL is a member of, I sit on that council as well, and that's chaired by the DCN and Major General Jason Walk of Army. So he's a logistics specialist. You probably know these people. So it's co-chaired by those 2 people. It includes myself and a number of operators, ship repair industry, union, one of the unions, who else? And some government departments, so Home Affairs, ABF, Department of Infrastructure, all sit on that committee. And that is a live discussion. So how do we get a reserve force that works in merchant and can be called up in times of need? Because if you did requisition a commercial ship, and that's part of the policy intent, is to create that requisitioning power, you would, depending on the circumstances, you would probably want Navy reservists operating on the ship as opposed to your bog standard crew, because, depending on the circumstances, obviously. So it is something that's being discussed. I don't know how far advanced Navy is in their thinking, because they sort of tell you what they want you to know. And I'm sure they're doing more thinking internally, but it's absolutely something that's being considered as a really advantageous way to do things.
And follow on from that, and finally, was there any discussion about having exercises in taking ships off from the trade and requisitioning ships?
Yes.
Say doing it once a year or once every 2 years,
yeah,
for say 2 weeks.
Yeah, so that's absolutely, the strategic fleet vessels will be utilised for that purpose. I think early days in developing the guidelines that we sort of formed the basis of the tender documents. Costings around taking ships up for exercise purposes were part of that discussion. So because you need to compensate the ship owner, you need to compensate the cargo user. So all of that stuff was discussed. And I mean, commercial ships are utilised for exercises now, particularly the Rio Tinto ships, Weeper Gladstone, are used, but they're not requisitioned. They're just say, oh, do you mind if we land a guy in black pyjamas on your deck? and the industry is very open to that. They really want to help wherever they can, but the answer is yes. Exercising is part of it.
Thank you. I'll now call on Alan Murray to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Angela. Your presentation on Australia's civil maritime capability has certainly highlighted the challenges, and they're clearly not just geostrategic. We've heard about skill sets, we've heard about taxation, policy framework, also the other issues that you've addressed. And they're all front of mind for us about how do we solve the issue of having a maritime capability. So in the audience today, you've heard from people who've got a family interest in the industry, have got a historical interest in the industry, and also people who have a strategic concern about the industry. In fact, the Institute itself is very interested in the industry. We share with you a recent academic paper, and also Chris Skinner has told about an academic paper he's just about to have published. So there is a depth of interest in your industry within the association. So we wish you and your association all the best as we move forward with this topic of interest. I'd now like to present you with some mementos of your time with the Institute. That's for you.
Lovely.
And contained within the envelope is an honorary membership of the Institute for the next 12 months.
Fabulous.
And on that, I would now like to invite those present to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much.